Hello and welcome back to the channel. If you're new here, hi, you're very welcome. This is Reading the Past and I'm Dr. Cat. Today's video is an amalgamation of a few different requests that I have received. So in the past, I've been asked to discuss Bessie Blount and Henry Fitzroy. Another query has been whether Henry VIII ever thought of making Fitzroy his heir, and another one asked me to talk about what might have happened if Fitzroy ever came to the English throne. So I thought it'd be fun to engage in some counterfactual history, to see if we could imagine the reign of King Henry IX. But before we look at that, I want to say a massive thank you to History Hit for sponsoring another video on this channel. History Hit is like Netflix, but for history. They have hundreds of programmes online, over 1,000 podcast episodes on their award-winning podcast network, and 5,000 history-related travel articles. And on top of that, new content is being added all the time because they launch 15 new podcast episodes and 2 new programmes every week. Whilst Dan Snow's History Hit continues to be the world's leading podcast, they now have 4 more podcast series. They have The Ancients, Warfare, Gone Medieval, and Not Just the Tudors. But this week, I'm looking forward to checking out this documentary, Ada Lovelace, Computing Pioneer. I want to learn more about this 19th century mathematician who just so happened to be the daughter of the famous poet Lord Byron, and who is also thought of as the world's first computer programmer. Click the link in my description box to find out more and to subscribe to History Hit. As an added bonus, my viewers are able to get 50% off your subscription for the next 3 months by using code READINGTHEPAST. Thanks again to History Hit for sponsoring this video. Now, let's look at Henry Fitzroy and what might have been. Now, before we begin on our counterfactual journey, I'm going to set myself a ground rule. And that is that we're only going to get one glitch in the timeline. That is that Henry Fitzroy doesn't die in 1536, but rather lives a full life. Anything that's not directly affected by that survival must continue on the established timeline. Of course, you may prefer to play this game another way, but I am not a chaos fairy, so this is how I'm going to need things to run. I also think that for us to explore what might have become of Henry Fitzroy, we need a grounding in who he was growing up to be. Elizabeth, also known as Bessie Blount, was born in around 1500. She was born to a family with blood ties to Sir Richard Croft, and he was steward to Prince Arthur Tudor's household for that young man's court at Ludlow. It's thought that this connection may have been very useful when it came to winning young Bessie a place as one of Catherine of Aragon's maids of honour in 1512. Girls like Bessie, who won coveted places like this, were expected to have qualities and skills that made them ornaments of the court. And certainly, Bessie was said to be beautiful and also a skilled musician, all of which led her to be a frequent participant in court masques. And this was a further honour, because it was one that placed her before the eyes of the whole court and also in front of every visiting dignitary and ambassador that was in England at the time. And this was even more true of her involvement in the New Year's revels of 1514, when Bessie was so fortunate as to be chosen to partner the king himself. Additionally, as Beverly A. Murphy points out, quote, her possession of a volume of poetry by John Gower suggests she was also well educated. We don't know when Henry VIII began a sexual relationship with Bessie or how long it lasted, but she did bear him a son in the summer of 1519, probably in the June. This child was named Henry for his father and was permitted to carry the surname Fitzroy as an acknowledgement that he was the natural son of the king, with the Roy of Fitzroy coming from the French for king, roi. Together then, it is a corruption of the French fille de roi. The infant was put into the charge of his godfather, Thomas Wolsey, and for the next few years, Wolsey would guide his education and the shape of his household. Henry Fitzroy's mother was rewarded with a wealthy husband, Gilbert Talboy, and additionally, she was granted property from his estates that would be worth £200 a year to her. Through this marriage, Fitzroy would become a big brother. Bessie and Gilbert would have 3 children, 2 boys and a girl. Bessie would continue to be the recipient of gifts and grants from the king. And there is also a suggestion that she would be permitted a fair degree of involvement in how her eldest boy was being raised and educated, and that she was allowed to exchange letters with his tutors. Fitzroy received an education that befitted a noble, someone who could expect to wield power and authority on the national and international stage. He studied French, Latin and Greek. He was taught music. However, he was said to favour more physical outdoor pursuits, and despite reports of his intelligence and academic aptitude, it was apparently sometimes a struggle to get him indoors and focus on his books. In short, the more I've learnt about Fitzroy and who he was growing into, the more he sounds very like his royal father. Indeed, the older he got, the more he was said to resemble him physically too. I'm sure this would have pleased Henry VIII. But from the start, Fitzroy's sex alone was something for Henry to crow over, because here was living proof that the king could make boys. So, if anyone was looking for the cause of the lack of princes in the royal nursery, they're going to have to look towards Catherine, rather than Henry himself. In 1525, when Fitzroy was around 6, he was made, in turn, a Knight of the Garter, Earl of Nottingham, Duke of Richmond, Duke of Somerset, Warden General of the Marches towards Scotland, and Lord Admiral of England. The titles of Richmond and Somerset had special significance, as they were indelibly tied to the houses of Tudor and Beaufort respectively. They also came with valuable lands, and in the first year alone, the revenues came to £4,845. Between 1525 and 1529, Fitzroy's main place of residence was in Yorkshire, and here, this little boy, from the ages of around 6 to 10, would preside over a ducal household, and he would be head of the Council of the North. During this period, there were also discussions about finding him a politically significant marriage. In 1527, Catherine de' Medici was discussed, as was the Infanta Maria of Portugal. Both came to nothing. On the 22nd of June, 1529, Fitzroy became Lord Lieutenant of Ireland, which some thought might have been a precursor to him being made King of Ireland. Later that year, on the 9th of August, 1529, this 10-year-old boy began to attend Parliament. A message was being sent that said, "This boy has the king's blood in his veins. He is a magnate with authority that is worthy of respect." Late 1529 also saw the fall of Thomas Wolsey, the man who had been in charge of Fitzroy's care and upbringing. Thomas Howard, 3rd Duke of Norfolk, uncle to both Anne Boleyn and Catherine Howard, was the man to replace Wolsey, and it's said that Anne was instrumental in this taking place. We talked about Norfolk's son, Henry Howard, Earl of Surrey, a couple of weeks ago in the video on the Wyatt Rebellion. He was that window-smashing rabble-rouser. But during 1530, he would also become a frequent companion to Henry Fitzroy. After all, he was only a couple of years older than him. It is a useful thing to be raised among the nobility, to grow up as their friend, especially if one day you might end up being their king. Also in 1530, on the 15th of April, Fitzroy's stepfather, Gilbert Talboys, died. At this point, Had Henry VIII not been fixed on a marriage to Anne Boleyn, potentially he might have sought to go through with his annulment so that he could marry Bessie, and thus have their son retrospectively legitimised. This chance would not come again, because Bessie married her second husband, Edward Fiennes de Clinton, by the 12th of February 1535. This couple would have 3 daughters and would remain married until Bessie's own death, which happened at some point between 1539 and 1541. This didn't prevent Henry VIII pushing his son to the forefront at home and abroad. Fitzroy joined his father and future stepmother on their diplomatic mission to the French court of Francis I in October 1532. Fitzroy was left behind to become a member of the French king's privy chamber as they wintered in Paris and went on progress the following summer. He was lodged with Francis' son, the Dauphin, also called Francis. The French king's other son, Henry, was with them as well, as was Henry Howard, Duke of Surrey. While he was away, he missed his father's wedding to Anne Boleyn and her lavish coronation. He also would have missed seeing Anne before she took to her rooms to await the birth of her child in seclusion, accompanied by her ladies alone. At the end of summer 1533, Fitzroy was brought back to England to marry Surrey's sister and Norfolk's daughter, Mary Howard, on the 26th of November 1533. The couple were both 14 years old, and their youth is often cited as a reason as to why their marriage was not consummated. After all, there was no need to rush these things. They were both young and healthy. There was every indication they would live a long and fruitful life together. Despite this recognition of his youth, politically he was still being favoured and treated as the magnate his father had made him. In 1534, he was given the lieutenancy of the Order of the Garter. He was also given responsibility to host a diplomatically significant event in this year too, because in November 1534, Fitzroy held a feast to celebrate the French admiral. The following February 1535, he entertained Eustace Chapuis, the imperial ambassador. Fitzroy was present within the walls of the Tower of London on the 19th of May 1536, where he witnessed the execution of Anne Boleyn. In the aftermath of this event, Fitzroy now had 2 half-sisters by his father, both of whom had been born to anointed queens, but who now, nevertheless, had been determined to be just as illegitimate as he was. I think it's unlikely that this bright boy, who had spent time in the company of the Howards, wouldn't have seen the advantage that his sex now gave him over them. Henry VIII didn't name Fitzroy as his heir, most likely because he still had hopes that Jane Seymour would finally be the wife that would do her duty, as he would have seen it. Nevertheless, the king continued to shower his son with affection in letters and preferment in politically significant positions. In May 1536, so the same month that Anne Boleyn was beheaded, Fitzroy became Chamberlain of Chester and North Wales, Lord Warden of the Cinque Ports, and Constable of Dover Castle. Fitzroy's illness, when it came, was sudden, surprising, and ultimately fatal. The illness, a respiratory infection apparently, was first reported on the 8th of July 1536, so when he was 17. Fitzroy died on the 23rd. But our purpose today is to postulate what might have happened if he had lived, if he either never fell ill or recovered fully. Fitzroy's father finally got his dearest wish, a live son born in the bonds of wedlock from his third wife, Jane Seymour. Little Edward was born on the 12th of October 1537 and was baptised in an elaborate ceremony 3 days later on the 15th of October. I think it's probable that if Fitzroy had still been alive, he would have played a key role in this ceremony. After all, his half-sister Mary was named godmother, while Elizabeth carried the chrism cloth. Perhaps then it would have been Fitzroy that had been the one to carry Elizabeth and the chrism cloth in place of Edward Seymour. Alternatively, Fitzroy may have been selected to be Edward's godfather alongside Mary. Fitzroy would have been 18 years old, as was his wife. So it's very likely that they would have been permitted to live together as husband and wife in the fullest sense of that term. Perhaps, as Fitzroy stood by the font for his infant half-brother, he would already have been able to think about the baby his own wife might soon give birth to. Is it possible that the presence of this now adult son, who was busily providing Henry VIII with a brace of grandchildren while also looking like his father and liking all the same things he did, might have been something that could cheer or even mollify his royal father? There would, of course, still be grief at the loss of Jane Seymour on the 24th of October, and I don't think that Fitzroy's survival would have impacted his father's marital adventures going forward. So there would still be the disappointment regarding Anne of Cleves, which would probably still lead to the execution of Thomas Cromwell. Catherine Howard would still lose her life, and Catherine Parr would still become wife number 6. Henry VIII would still suffer the ill health and pain that may have made him hard to keep happy. Might the visits of Henry and Mary Fitzroy and the children have provided the king with some welcome distraction, maybe even a sense of relief? His son had made it to adulthood and had made children, perhaps even a son or 2 of his own. If one son, born out of wedlock, could do it, then surely the fully legitimate Edward would do the same. When the king decided to go in person to make war against the French in 1544, leaving Catherine Parr behind as his regent, I think Fitzroy would have gone too, probably in a position of advanced command. It probably wouldn't have changed the eventual outcome. The money will run out, there will be a stalemate, and eventually a peace treaty will be signed. But there may not have been that embarrassing loss by the English forces at St Etienne, which ultimately discredited Fitzroy's brother-in-law, the Earl of Surrey. Indeed, would a surviving Fitzroy's connection to the Howards, through his marriage to Mary, provide his father-in-law Norfolk and his brother-in-law Surrey with some political insulation, a defence against the suspicion that would see them both determined to be traitors and imprisoned in the Tower of London, awaiting execution, and in the case of Surrey, actually being executed in 1547. If it did, if it saved them, then we have an interesting faction forming as we head into the last months of Henry VIII's life, with Fitzroy, Norfolk and Surrey being a fairly formidable force if they don't have that finger of suspicion being pointed towards them. Arguably, Fitzroy's position would be even stronger, because I think it's very likely that he would have been included in the Succession to the Crown Act of 1543, which presumably would have placed him and his heirs as the next in line to the throne after Edward. This would have bumped Mary and Elizabeth further down, but as all 3 had been determined to be illegitimate, presumably Fitzroy's sex would have pushed him to the front. When Henry VIII died on the 28th of January 1547, Fitzroy would have been nearly 28 years old. He would have proven himself as a soldier and magnate. He had ties and even familial bonds with powerful members of the nobility, and on top of this, Fitzroy would have reminded everyone of the king that they had just lost. I think it's very likely that Fitzroy would have been placed at the heart of his little brother's regency council, and perhaps he would even have been a lone protector for him. Fitzroy strikes me as the sort of big brother that Edward could have easily hero worshipped too, and that could only have been a bonus. Perhaps Fitzroy would have seen the affection that Catherine Parr showed to all his father's children, coupled with the strong work that she had done as regent while he and Henry VIII had gone warring in France. Maybe that would lead him to bring her into the governance of the realm, or even the control of the king's person. Would this have changed her behaviour? If she wasn't closed off from the new king and from the corridors of power, I think she might not have married Thomas Seymour, or at least she might not have done so quite so quickly or so secretly. We do have that evidence from the reports of his schooling that Fitzroy might have shared his father's early distaste for paperwork. Is it possible that he would have taken a similarly hands-off approach to the Regency government? Would he let the Howards, Seymours and Dudleys squabble in council before finally swanning in and making the final call? If he did, then I think it would be very likely that his position would have swiftly become unassailable. We don't have a clear indication of Henry Fitzroy's faith. It seems that his wife was keen on the reforming movement, at least towards the start, and that this had displeased her brother, the Earl of Surrey. So would Fitzroy lean towards his wife or to his friend and brother-in-law? I'm inclined to say that Fitzroy probably would have ensured that his little brother's church followed a similar character to that of their father. I think that Fitzroy might have tempered any reforming zeal in his brother, and perhaps he would have managed those who surrounded and influenced the young king in order to achieve this. So, the king's headship of the church would be forcefully defended, but as to the rest, it would presumably have remained a settlement that their other sibling, Mary, could still live with. Disapprovingly, sure, but I think quietly. When Edward VI falls ill in 1553, I can't see a device for the succession still being produced. Rather, the third act of succession and Henry VIII's final will would be the documents that were followed. After Edward's death, on the 6th of July 1553, a 34-year-old Henry Fitzroy would ascend to his brother's throne to become King Henry IX. There would, I think fairly quickly, be a lavish joint coronation for Henry and his queen Mary. Soon afterward, their eldest son, assuming one had already been born, would be created Prince of Wales. Betrothals to the leading dynasties of Europe would then be sought and probably secured for any unmarried children. As we know, a smart monarch marries their children into as many European royal houses as he has offspring to wed, in which case England potentially becomes more connected to the great powers of Europe under Fitzroy than happened with his half-sisters, and especially with Elizabeth. Fitzroy's wife is thought to have died in December 1555, and assuming that would still be the case if Fitzroy had lived, this king is now on the international marriage market himself, and so can further shore up his rule with marriage to a foreign princess. Fitzroy is probably going to face challenges to his rule, possibly in his half-sisters' names, or in the name of his grey cousins, or even his Stuart ones. It is possible that his half-sister Mary might have challenged his accession as she did with Lady Jane Grey, but I think she would have had less success in the case of Fitzroy. And that's because he would have been known to the people and the court, and most likely he would have been recognised as the individual who could best follow on from his father. I did wonder if Spain might intervene, but as there wasn't a massive deployment of forces from the Emperor to support Mary's challenge to Lady Jane Grey, I do think the same would be true in the case of Fitzroy. Would King Henry IX see to it that both of his sisters would make noble and appropriate marriages of their own? Perhaps he would have seen to Mary's marriage during Edward's reign, so maybe she would have been overseas, perhaps even raising her own children when their brother Edward died and Fitzroy ascended. Right, so I think I have now stretched my capacity to make educated guesses, as what happens next depends on children that were never born, their marriages and their descendants. Instead, what we're left with is a host of questions, which I think is probably the most significant value of doing a counterfactual history thought experiment, because by being drawn to ask those questions, I think we are made to confront how pivotal certain, arguably most moments were, and indeed are. I think it also brings us closer, potentially as close as is possible, to how past events were experienced by those who lived through them. After all, we know what really happens next, which risks us reading history backwards and as if it were a foregone conclusion. I think that a counterfactual exploration throws up the uncertainty, confusion, and even in some cases the anxiety that would have been felt by our ancestors. In the case of this change in the Henry Fitzroy timeline, here are some of the questions that I have been left with. First, how long does the Tudor dynasty continue and hold the throne? Do the Stuarts ever sit on the English throne? Well, if not, then there's probably no Act of Union, so no United Kingdom. Is there going to be an English Civil War? Is there going to be a Glorious Revolution? If not, without William of Orange's intervention, what would the situation in Ireland be like? If the Habsburgs aren't breathing down Fitzroy's neck in the way they did with Elizabeth, does England take on her seafaring and, frankly, piratical ways? Maybe not. So then there's no circumnavigation. Perhaps no Roanoke colony and no Jamestown? Arguably then, the United States would look pretty different. Perhaps the presence of English as a spoken language would be far smaller. But what do you think? Is this how you think Fitzroy's story would have played out if he had survived? As always, I'm looking forward to reading your conversations in the comments section underneath this video. Or you can find me on some other social media platforms. I will leave links to the other places you can find me on the internet in my description box. Do follow me over on some or all of them so that we can continue this conversation and start some others. I do hope you enjoyed this video and found it useful. If you did, why not share it with your friends? Please also let me know you liked it by hitting the thumbs up. Please subscribe to the channel and check you are subscribed if you think you are. Make sure YouTube hasn't mysteriously unsubscribed you. While you're there, checking, subscribing, or maybe resubscribing, please also hit the bell icon beside the subscribe button and then select all in the drop-down menu so that YouTube will tell you when I've next uploaded. I hope you're going to have a great day, whatever you're doing, and I look forward to speaking to you all in my next video. Take care of yourselves. Bye-bye for now.